Thank you. Yeah, so Steve phoned me 10 days ago and said, I can't make it to this conference in Tucson. Would you be willing to step in for me? And I said, will there be actual live people there? And he said, yes, there will be. And I said, I don't believe you. Will there be live people? And I asked the organizer, I asked Dan the same thing on the phone, will there be actual people there? And he said, there will be actual people there. And I said, I'm there. So my wife and I are very pleased to have made our first trip to Tucson. And we love the place. Yeah. You know, a couple of exciting things happened, a couple of firsts for us this morning, in fact. We live in Orange County, and we thought until today that we had legitimate cacti in Orange County. We were blown away by the size of the cacti here. There's nothing like that where we live, so we love that. We're having breakfast out on the patio, and a bird came up, and I was saying, what kind of bird is that? And I thought, that's a roadrunner. I thought that was just a cartoon character. There's actual roadrunners. I've seen the first roadrunner. So 2 firsts for us. We're delighted to be here, and I'm delighted that you're all here. It's great to gather, and this has been a difficult season for me. I love gathering with people. I've had lots of conferences canceled. The last conference I gave was in January in Dallas, and then everything got canceled. So it's great to be here with actual people. Now, also, when I was listening to John, he's a friend of mine, I kept whispering to my wife, that's one of my points. That's one of my points. That's one of my... So I'm glad that my points sort of coalesce around points that John's making. I'm going to make them a slightly different way, and sometimes it's good to hear good points made in slightly different ways multiple times because they're kind of complex. At least part of what I'm talking about is going to resonate a lot with what John said. So how 4-year-olds grasp design better than most biology professors. I like to put a little edge in my titles. I like to offend people if I can. So this is largely based on this book called Undeniable, How Biology Confirms Our Intuition that Life is Designed. And the idea of this book was, although I've spent decades doing laboratory technical research with other people and publishing peer-reviewed science papers looking at testing Darwinism and whether it can work at the level of single genes and finding that it doesn't work, when I got an opportunity to write this book, I felt like a better approach than simplifying the science would be to show people that this isn't really a technical question. The question of whether we are cosmic accidents or whether we were made by a personal God is a common sense question. It's not really a technical question. And really, it can be more potent to understand it that way as a common sense question. Because if we make it a technical question, then if you don't have a PhD or you haven't done scholarly work on it, then you really don't have a right to speak to it. But if it's a common sense question where we all really know it's true, then everybody has a right to speak to it. And I think that's what this really is. There are other questions, deep questions. Sir Peter Medawar was quoted by John Lennox as saying that children ask some of the deepest questions, and here's one of them, the question of existence. And I want to show you that on some of these deep questions, children also answer them better than the experts sometimes. So here is a true expert, historical expert on the question of existence. His name was Gorgias. It had nothing to do with his looks. One of the Greek philosophers who spent his whole life asking what is the nature of existence, what is the set of things that exist, what can we say about existence. And toward the end of his life, he came to this conclusion. I contend that you and I have not spent nearly as much time as he did on that, and we may not be nearly as smart as he is, but we know that he got it wrong, okay? We know that he got it wrong. In this case, there's something obvious, and sometimes very bright people can spend a lot of time on questions and they somehow lose the obvious by getting too drilled in on things that are highly technical. And something like that, I think, has happened on this question, the question of origins as well. There's an obvious answer to the question, are we here by accident? And the 4-year-olds get that, but somehow you can get trained out of it. So you can be a professor of biology and think that the 4-year-olds have it wrong. Well, I'm here to say that the 4-year-olds actually have it right. Here, I'm not the only one noticing that the 4-year-olds attribute design to God. This is a quote from a Wall Street Journal article by UC Berkeley psychology professor Alison Gopnik. She wrote, "By elementary school age, children start to invoke an ultimate godlike designer to explain the complexity of the world around them, even children brought up as atheists." And when I read that, I was working on the book. When I read that, I thought, that's interesting. So atheist parents can be trying to raise their kids to be atheists, and they find that they're having their kids attributing a butterfly to a godlike designer. And they must look at each other and say, did you tell her that? No, I didn't tell her that. Did you tell her that? No. Somehow, she just got that on her own. A 4-year-old understands this. That's interesting. That means it must be sort of a built-in thing that we all understand this. Here's an article where the quote came from called "See Jane Evolve, Picture Books Explain Darwin." So Gopnik was not saying this is good that the 4-year-olds get this. She was saying it's bad that the 4-year-olds think this way, because that causes more work for the high school biology teachers and the college teachers who are going to have to undo this bad thinking and teach them Darwinism. So why not start earlier with picture books from, age 4? You start reading them to your kids and teach them about Darwin earlier on. Well, if she's right about that, it's an elitist view of science, isn't it? It's a view that looks like this. Only the learned, the scholars, the people with the PhDs in the academy, they stand on a peak. They see things clearly with respect to our origins, and the rest of us are dependent on them. The rest of us are down here on the low ground, looking up to them to receive wisdom from them, because otherwise we're helpless. And the wisdom they're giving us on origins is a philosophy that's called materialism, broadly. So Darwinism comes under materialism. Materialism is the idea that there is nothing other than matter and energy, space and time. Atoms and molecules is everything, okay? It's all physics. And so you say, does that mean there's no God? And they would say, yes, that means there is no God. God is an idea that came about after humans evolved through a physical process, and humans started to invent deities to solve their problems. And God is an invention of humans. It's all physics. That is the idea that owns the academy right now. However, if the 4-year-olds are right, the true picture looks more like this, okay? The academy has dug itself into a hole, and once you're in there, you can't easily get out of it. And the 4-year-olds and the rest of us see on these big issues. I'm not saying quantum mechanics. Yes, you need to be an expert to understand quantum mechanics, but who needs to understand quantum mechanics? To understand the big things like where did we come from and where are we going, we get that just fine through common sense and through what's innate in us. It's the thing that tells the 4-year-old, whether their parents are atheists or Christians, when they see the butterfly, that was made by a godlike designer. So, if this is the picture, then it reminds me of a certain children's story about a naked emperor, right? Because this is an interesting story, because everyone knows what's true, but they're pretending that they believe something else. And why are they pretending? It's to look good, right? It's to look smart. And I think something like that is happening in the academy. Once you become aware of the fact that the smart people think a certain way, and you want to be smart, you want to be thought of as smart, that applies a certain peer pressure to you that you need to think that way as well. And that's very much going on in the academy. I'm going to give just a brief plug for this new book that I've just co-authored with William Briggs and Jay Richards. And it might seem like this has nothing to do, what does COVID have to do with evolution? Well, it has this to do. The title is The Price of Panic: How the Tyranny of Experts Turned a Pandemic into a Catastrophe. Here's the thing that is the connection: the tyranny of experts. That I think we're living in an era, we're seeing playing out in 2020, how a handful of people, I'm not dissing expertise, it's a good thing, but when a handful of experts starts to get control and the ability to exclude the other experts, and by the way, there are experts who are disagreeing with lockdowns, but you're not hearing about them because the experts who have gained control of the microphone are excluding them, okay? So this is the problem. The problem is not expertise, the problem is tyranny of the experts, and that's the connection between this book and biology, because guess what? There are experts in biology who say evolution doesn't work. And there are experts in the philosophy of mind, like Thomas Nagel, who is quoted by John Lennox, who say it doesn't work. But you don't hear much from them because, again, the microphone has been taken away from them. I have a friend at Harvey Mudd College who just authored a paper with these other people at Harvey Mudd and at Claremont McKenna that coins this wonderful term, a Castro consensus. So you hear people talking about the scientific consensus says this. Well, this paper is saying a lot of the times you hear about that, it's really a Castro consensus, meaning this is reference to Cuba. Yes, you can get a consensus if you threaten the people who are trying to disagree with you, but that's not a useful consensus. Here's a quote from that paper. A consensus can only be trusted to the extent that individuals are free to disagree with it. Otherwise, it's peer pressure, right? And so when you're hearing these references to the scientific consensus is this, you're usually hearing about a Castro consensus. And I hope that term deserves to become very popular, so I hope it circulates. Okay, I went the wrong way. I'm going to give you, what time did I start, by the way? Because I want to take my full, I started at about 7:30. No. I'm going to take my full 45 minutes. I'm going to give you two arguments that are common sense arguments, and they're powerful arguments against materialism. And one of them I call the argument from introspection, and this one is going to resonate with what John Lennox just said. But it's going to be a slightly different take on it, but it's going to resonate with what you just heard from John Lennox. And the second one is going to be the argument from observation. And they're both commonsensical arguments. I'm going to pitch them in that way. So, the argument from introspection. What we mean by that, introspection, is just looking within, thinking about how we think or what it's like to be a human. The argument from introspection. And it starts with this idea that all human reasoning is founded on, it's grounded in assumptions, right? And some people might pretend that that's not true, that we can know things with certainty, that we're smart, that we've figured things out. Scientists, mathematicians, academics tend to sort of be arrogant in this respect. They think we know things that are not predicated or not dependent on anything at all. We know this to be true. In fact, all human reasoning and all human thought is ultimately grounded in faith. And I want to show you why that's the case. It's the case because I could be so totally insane that I'm not making sense of anything. And I'm not saying I am, and I hope you don't say that I am. But if we go through this exercise of saying, how do we know that we're not? You reach a humbling conclusion that actually we can't prove that we're not. And the reason that we can't prove that is, well, what if I am? What if I am so insane that all of this you're not actually out there, this is a delusion, I'm not able to string together any coherent thoughts at all. All the words that I think I'm speaking are nonsense. If that were true, what could I do to show that it's false? I couldn't do anything without presupposing that it's false, right? So we can't even embark upon this exercise of human thought without trusting that it's not a complete waste of time. We have to start with the faith position that maybe this isn't nonsense, maybe I'm not insane, maybe this is not an illusion, maybe there's sense to be made of this, but I only take that to be true on faith because I can't prove it to be true. Because if it's not true, I can't prove anything, because an insane person can't prove anything, right? So we take this to be true on faith and nothing but faith, okay? Once we take that to be true on faith, now we can do science. Okay, so don't let anyone tell you that science does not depend on faith. It does. We just proved it. If I'm insane, I can't do science, right? So I have to start by taking on faith that I'm not insane and there is sense to be made of all this. Now I can do science, but I have to take another thing on faith to do science. And that is that, okay, maybe I'm not insane, maybe I can think, maybe I can string thoughts together. Is this outside world that I think I'm experiencing, is it an objective thing so that I can study it, and then describe what I find to you. And then you go and study it. We drop balls, we do physics. I can describe things and hope that you can go do the same thing that I did, replicate my work, and you say, yes, he's right, or no, he's wrong. And then we can talk about it. We can only do science if that outside objective world is there. It's called realism. We take realism to be true. There's a real world out there. We have our internal world where we're doing our thinking, but we're thinking about stuff that's out there, and it's real. It really is out there. Well, you can't prove that it's out there, right? There's no experiment I can do with test tubes that shows that the real world is out there, because the test tubes are in the real world. If it's not there, then I'm not actually doing an experiment, right? So we have to take this to be true on faith, just as we had to take our sanity to be true on faith. Science will never prove that there's a real world out there. It assumes there's a real world out there, okay? You can only do science once you've taken these two things to be true, and only faith gives you these, right? Once you've taken these to be true on faith, now we can go and try to come up with explanations about how the world works. Well, here's an interesting thing. What if we were to do this and be very proud of ourselves for getting our PhDs and for getting positions in the academy and coming up with explanations of how the world works? What if some of our explanations have implications for these faith positions? And what if they're negative implications? Like, what if we came up with an explanation and we call it science and we laugh at people for not believing it? What if this scientific explanation we come up with, if we took it seriously, would totally undermine our confidence in thought, in our ability to think? You just heard a quote from Darwin, where Darwin was worried about this. How can we trust an evolved mind from lesser animals? He was worrying about this. What if our supposed scientific explanation undercuts our confidence in thought? Then it would undercut our confidence in science. We wouldn't be able to do science, and it would undercut the explanation itself. This is called the self-defeating explanation, okay? Is there such a thing? Yes, there is, okay? And materialism, the idea that there's nothing but atoms and molecules, space and time, matter and energy, is a self-defeating explanation. And I'm going to show you how you can know that, how you can be confident of that. I have a demonstration of this in the book Undeniable that talks about numbers. And I actually had an experience in my middle school years in 8th grade. I had a really great math teacher who once stumped us by asking the question, where are numbers? And, we were saying, well, they're in our math book. And he said, no, those are numerals. Those are not numbers. Where are numbers? And we did not know what he was getting at, or even why are you asking us this? And eventually, after he tortured us with this for, seemed like ages, probably a whole minute, a girl said, well, they're in our heads. And he said, that's right. They're in our heads. Numbers are in our heads. And what he actually meant was they're in our minds, okay? And I'm going to show you there's a distinction between something being in our head, meaning in our brain, versus in our mind. And it's a distinction between being physical and being non-physical. So in the book, I asked the reader to imagine being in a brain imaging lab, more sophisticated than any real brain imaging lab. It's got futuristic imaging apparatus in it, and you're sitting there, laying there you're in a chair reclined, and they've got these probes all over your scalp and complex instruments all over that are showing images in real time, and they can zoom in and look at absolutely everything that's happening in your brain. This is beyond what they can really do, but let's pretend there is this. And let's pretend that the scientists there are asking you to count from 1 to 10 and sort of meditate on the numbers. Think about these numbers as you go from 1 to 10. Take your time. And you say 1, and you're thinking about 1, and you say 2. And they go, wait a minute. Okay, stop. 2. You just said 2. Is this what you mean when you say 2? When you said 2, is this what you mean by the number 2? This activated part in your frontal lobe, is that what you mean? And you say no, I'm perfectly content to say that my frontal lobe was activated when I'm thinking about the numbers. That's not what I mean by the numbers. That might be happening, but that's not what I mean by the number. And so they zero in. They say, well, you have to be meaning You have to be meaning something physical because there isn't anything but physics. These are materialist scientists. They say there's nothing but the physical world. So whatever you mean when you're using these words, 1, 2, 3, it has to be here somewhere. So let's drill in and look more closely. And they show you a specific synapse. This synapse fired with these neurons when you said 2. Is that what you mean when you say 2? And you say, no. I'm not denying that a synapse fired. Maybe there's a synapse that fired, but that's not what I mean when I say 2. And they insist you must mean something. There's nothing non-physical. You say, well, I'm meaning a concept. It's a counting number. It's 1 more than 1, 1 less than 3. And they're saying, you're talking about concepts as if there could be non-physical things that are real. And you say, yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. And they're saying there isn't anything that isn't physical. And your answer to that would be, if I take you seriously about that there isn't anything that's not physical, what you're saying is, I am fundamentally confused about every word that I'm using. Because I think, when I'm thinking, I'm manipulating non-physical things. And if you're insisting that I'm wrong, you're insisting that I'm crazy, okay? Because you're insisting that I am fundamentally confused about every word that I'm using. And if you're insisting that I'm crazy, then then all of this vanishes. We have these two choices. Either I am manipulating concepts, which are non-physical, and that's what I think I'm doing, or if you guys are right, I am being manipulated by neurons. I'm being tricked. But if I'm being tricked, this is a deception, and I should reject the whole thing. And if it's a deception, we're back to this, okay? I've just lost my confidence in my ability to think. I've lost science. You don't exist. I'm not in a brain imaging lab. That was a thought I had, but you just told me that I can't think. So now I don't believe any of it. And I've just lost materialism. So this is how the whole thing implodes. It's self-destructive. The conclusion is I am either you give up on everything, including science, and of course none of these scientists want to do that. They want to preserve science. Either you give it the whole thing up and say, this is insanity, or you acknowledge that the non-physical is real, okay? And our thought life is real, and our mind is real, and is not our brain. We need a brain, okay? And I'm not denying that if you give me the propofol to put me asleep, it will affect the brain, and I will not be conscious. There's a connection between the brain and the mind, but they are not the same thing. The mind is thinking, the mind is not physical, thoughts are not physical. Brains do not think. So, here's the picture of reality then, and it has to be this. There is a mental realm and there is a material realm. We're not denying the material. Our brain is material, but it cannot be doing the thinking. We lose everything if you say that the brain is thinking. If you say that thought is physical, you say that we are so confused that we don't even know if brains exist. The mental realm is where the thinking is occurring. The physical realm is where your brain is. And we are complex creatures that have both a physical body and a non-physical soul, spirit, self, mind. It has to be that way, otherwise everything implodes. Okay, that's the argument from introspection, and a lot of that resonated with what Dr. Lennox said, and that's pretty good company. I like to agree with Dr. Lennox. Now we're going to talk about the argument from observation. So this will be stuff that Dr. Lennox didn't say. And this will be more connected with the research that I've done in the lab, the scientific research. But again, I want to give a common sense version of this. You don't have to go into a lab to know that we are not cosmic accidents. And the argument that I'm going to give that's commonsensical is based on coincidence. And it turns out we have a natural faculty for coincidence that's quite remarkable. So let me show you what I mean by that. If someone were to take a red piece of paper and wad it up and throw it on the floor, and it were to look like that, and I were to say, hey, that looks like the head of an elephant to me. Can you see it? Trunk, big ears. It looks like the head of an elephant. You wouldn't say, oh my gosh, someone just made the head of an elephant by wrinkling up a piece of red paper. The reason you wouldn't be shocked, you could call that a coincidence, but it's so believable because that's not a compelling head of an elephant, right? It's messy. We're sort of we know what an elephant looks like, and we can sort of impose that on this crumpled piece of paper. Whereas no one would ever crumple up a piece of paper and it look like that, right? Usually you can spend an hour on a piece of paper and it doesn't look like that, okay? If a 4-year-old were to walk into a room and had never seen origami cranes before and they saw that on the table, they would know that someone made that, right? They would know for sure that someone made that. Things like that don't happen by accident. So the 4-year-old then knows that this cannot be a coincidence. The 4-year-old knows that that could be a coincidence, but that can't be a coincidence. Somebody did this. I use alphabet soup to illustrate this in the book. And it turns out to be kind of when you pour, I don't know when the last time you had alphabet soup, but you're looking for words, right? If you got alphabet soup, you're looking for words that form in the soup. And even in a random jumble of letters like this, there's going to be words just by coincidence. And we don't think it's spooky if you find a coincidental word, right? But they're always going to look like coincidence, right? So there's S-E-A, it's a short word, it's messy. But you can find short words like that. There's May, again, it's messy, the A's upside down. And Rose, 4-letter word, okay? But again, you don't go, oh my goodness, there's a 4-letter word in the alphabet soup, because you had to do most of the work. It's like the elephant head, right? When I showed this the first time, someone pointed out holy. Do you see holy under C-H-O-L-Y? Now that is not a coincidence. No, that's a coincidence as well. But if you were to lift the lid on a pot of alphabet soup and see this, okay, you would know that somebody spent some time arranging letters, right? That would not happen by coincidence. And a 4-year-old knows that as well, to say nothing of this, okay? That won't happen by accident. Now, the 4-year-old knows this. What I'd like to do is just spend a few minutes asking whether can we use science or math to prove that the 4-year-old is actually right. And it's interesting because we can, but we're not saying that the 4-year-old did science. I'm going to show you simple math. But the 4-year-old didn't take out a calculator and go, hang on. Yeah, my brother must have done this. You don't need to do that. I'm going to show you also why you don't need the calculator, but you could use a calculator. So let's look at this. And I've put a grid of squares superimposed over this picture. And the squares are about the size of the pasta letters. And you've got 23 grid squares. And there's something somewhat exceptional or special about all 23 of these grid squares. The 5 in the middle are special because they have the letters that spell out the word pasta. And the 18 around them are special because they're cleared of pasta letters. So it makes the word pasta pop, right? Because it's cleared and then you have the 5 letters. Well, all we have to do to put a number on how improbable it would be to stir up some alphabet soup, put it on the stove, turn off the heat, lift the lid, and just by chance get this, is to ask how unlikely or how rare is each of those grid squares. So the ones that are cleared are rare because if you just look at the gamish around them, it's pretty rare to have open space, right? Because you have the letters all over. So that's fairly rare, but it's extraordinarily rare to have letters lined up correctly to spell a word, particularly if it's the right letters to spell a word. So what if we just say, this is just a rough calculation. Let's say that the 18 squares that are surrounding the word pasta are 1 in 10 unusual, which would mean if you put that grid over the whole pot, you'd have to look at least 10 squares before you'd find a clearing. And I think I'm probably being generous there. You probably have to look at more than 10. And let's say that the 5 squares with the letters are 1 in 100 unusual, which means it's like 1 in 100 of these grid squares before you'd find a letter that's correctly oriented, not upside down, and spelling a word, because it's fairly rare to get words to come together and spell a word. And those ones that we found that, like Rose, those weren't lined up like this, okay? So it's fairly rare. Okay, 1 in 100 unusual, 1 in 10 unusual. How unlikely then is the whole thing put together? this. Well, you can do the math from these 1 in 10 and 1 in 100, and it looks like this. The whole pattern is 1 in 10 to the 18th, so it's the 18 squares that are 1 in 10, times 100 to the 5th. And those are the 5 squares that are 1 in 100 unusual. Well, when you multiply this out, you get the whole pattern is 1 in 10 octillion unusual. In other words, this will never, ever, ever happen. You could fill the seas with alphabet soup, and this will never happen. There's not enough material there for this ever to happen. So we've just used our calculators and gone through a nerdy little exercise to show what a 4-year-old didn't need to go through that exercise to understand, right? But we've also shown why they didn't need to. It's the basic principle here is whenever lots of things that are even somewhat improbable have to come together, you end up with a staggering improbability. It will never happen by accident. And the 4-year-old gets that because all the things that a 4-year-old spots that they know someone did, it's because they know someone had to know how to arrange it, right? And this is arranged. It's not brilliant, okay? This is not brilliant. But it won't ever happen by accident because it's improbable, and lots of improbable things coming together is astonishingly improbable. It would take a spooky coincidence for it to happen. It's the same logic for the origami crane, right? It's lots of things that have to come together correctly, and chance will not make them come together correctly. Usually even an attempt by an inexperienced paper folder will not cause them to come together correctly. So you don't need a calculator. It's obvious when you see something that pops because it has a high-level function, has a high-level impact. It's obvious that someone knew what they were doing to make it work. And why do you have to know what you're doing? Because you have to arrange a whole bunch of things carefully. And anytime someone had to arrange a whole bunch of things carefully, chance won't do that because chance doesn't arrange things carefully. Okay, so in my book, I refer to the whole class of things like this that the 4-year-old would look at and know that someone did it. I refer to these as inventions, and I have a diagram that shows a hierarchical structure that all these inventions have. And this doesn't have to be a technical invention. It could be something very simple and ordinary. It could be the origami crane. It could be a text message. There's a top-level thing, which is the invention itself, that does something at a high level. It accomplishes some task. And it requires know-how to do it. And the reason it requires know-how is someone had to arrange components within components to make this thing work. These components could be the individual folds of the origami crane. They could be the letters in a text message as you're typing a text message. The letters could be these elementary constituents at the bottom, and the words are one level up, and a sentence is one level up from that. A paragraph is up from that. All kinds of things that we're familiar with are inventions, and they all have this kind of structure. And anything that has this kind of structure, we know can't happen by accident because every single one of these things has to be arranged just so to contribute to the function one level up. That's what these arrows are. The elementary constituents, so like the letters to make a word, you have to get them arranged right, and they make a word. The words have to be arranged right to make a sentence, right? They're all contributing to that top level function, and none of these are likely to happen by accident. Put it all together, and it's utterly impossible for it to happen by accident. So, when you see, this is now a very antiquated digital camera, but when you see something like this, and you see what it does, if a 4-year-old sees, oh, that's a picture of my brother on the back of this box. This 4-year-old does not need to know that they don't need to know what parts are inside this, right? They just know that it's doing something that a rock doesn't do, right? This is cool, it's doing something clever. And without exception, things that do something clever, that high-level function, they do have this complex componentry within them. Don't do this, by the way. This invalidates the warranty. I don't know what these parts are, and we don't have to know what these parts are. We know that for a digital camera to work or anything complex to work, takes many, many parts, each of which is specifically crafted for some sub-function, and they wouldn't be there if they weren't contributing to the function, the overall function, in this case of the camera. It's true of an automobile, it's true of a smartphone, it's true of everything. It's true of all these man-made, human-made things. And if it's true of these things, because they perform a high-level function, how much more true would it be of these things, okay? How much more true would it be of these things? Now, it's far more true, is the answer. You can take apart that camera, and after a few layers, you're down to the materials, a piece of aluminum, or a piece of plastic, or a piece of glass. I'm going to give you an idea for how many layers you would have to go down and down and down and down if you look at a human being, a human body, and you're still seeing brilliance within brilliance within brilliance within brilliance, layer and layer and layer. You start at the top with a human. The layer below that would be the organ level complexity of a human being, which is astonishing. All these remarkable components that work together to enable us to function as humans. And you could look at any one of these and find further layers within layers. So if we look at one of the eyes, you see the eyeball staring at you over the right hand there, right arm. If we look at an eye and explode the structure of an eye, you have tissue level structure to an eye, the retina, the scleria, the cornea, the vasculature for the eye to perform its function as the organ of vision, and any of the other functions that we look at would have a similar tissue level complexity, pieces of the eye that have to come together in the right way in order for the eye to function. You could look at any one of these tissues and see a cellular complexity. There's the retina showing the rod and cone cells, and you see the organized complexity of the retina. You could look at any one of those cells and see cellular. I lost my cell picture. I had a picture of a cell showing the interior of a cell and the extraordinary complexity of the organelles and the subcellular structure. And then you go below that all the way down to the molecular structure. So this shows you, this is an enzyme, which is a protein complex, and basically all the work, all of the magic that's happening inside cells to make the cellular processes work is done by proteins or protein complexes. And enzymes is the name. We call a protein that does chemistry an enzyme. So it's usually not a single protein molecule. It's usually multiple molecules that dock together and form a machine. But proteins also do literal spinning 100,000 RPM machines in cells, and they do scaffolds, and they do Dr. Lennox showed the kinesin, the thing that walks along the microtubule. There's an awesome video of that. It actually looks like it's wearing Nikes and it's going like this, and it's carrying the big load behind it. It's phenomenal. Those are proteins. This is a massive protein complex called the ribosome, which is it is the complex that takes the genetic material that's been transcribed into RNA, and this is what reads along the RNA and makes new proteins. So this is made of proteins, and it's required to make proteins. If you look at smaller individual protein molecules, they have folds that look sort of artistically rendered like this. There's thousands of these distinct folded structures, and it turns out you need to have a very carefully arranged string of amino acids in order to get it to fold at all. Usually it'll just flop around and get chewed up. And this is what I devoted the first part of my career to, was how hard is it to string the amino acids together to get it to fold at all, okay? It was known that these things are special, but how special are they? Can you mess it up? Could an accidental string of amino acids fold and form one of these things that works? So the amino acids, you've heard of amino acids, but those are the components, the biological small molecules that get strung together by this incredible ribosome complex to make these strings that have the very special property of forming these very important biological shapes that are the protein folds. Thousands of these at work in every single cell. When I first started this work, it was not known how hard or how easy it is for a chance event to string amino acids together to do this. And some people were arguing, well, it's easy. If you just string them together, probably some of them will fold and some of them will work. Well, so I thought, well, that's a good question to go into the lab and try to answer. So we went into the lab, and this is an enzyme that I studied. It's beta-lactamase. This is the enzyme that allows bacteria to be resistant to penicillin antibiotics. So this is bad as far as we're concerned, good as far as bacteria are concerned. And it's a good enzyme for doing experiments where I could mess up the gene that allows bacteria to make this, and find out how badly can you mess this up and have it still resist penicillin. So I just mess them up by the millions, throw the messed up genes in bacteria, put the bacteria on petri dishes with a little bit of penicillin, and if they grew and formed a colony, that means this is still working, and if they didn't, it's not. So I could count. I could say, okay, I put 10,000 of these down, and only 4 of them work. That means 4 out of 10,000 work. Well, I did that for multiple regions within this enzyme, and I got my answer, and I published a number in this paper in Journal of Molecular Biology back in 2004. And the number, I'll tell you the number in just a bit. I want to illustrate the number. So let's think of this. If chance had to do this, how hard would it be to do this? So if it's 1 in a million, you might say, well, that's pretty hard. But come on. There's millions of opportunities out there for a 1 in a million thing to happen. So if you have a million opportunities, then a 1 in a million thing will happen. So the question is, how big is this target that you have to hit in order for a string of amino acids to actually do this magic of folding up and being ready for a function in the cell? And I want to illustrate that in terms of this target metaphor. So here's how I do this usually. I need a volunteer for this. It won't hurt. I'm going to use a pair of laser pointers, and somebody, without looking, is going to use one laser pointer, but not shine it in anyone's eyes. Can you see on the ceiling, or is it too bright? You can see the dot. And I'm going to put a red dot on the ceiling, and then someone's going to try to search for it blindly without looking, and just see if you happen to find the red dot. Anybody good with laser pointers? Are you my laser pointer volunteer? Okay. No, you need to put that over your eyes. No. There you go. So there's the button there, right there. Okay, so you're going to be pointing that upward, but you're going to close your eyes when I so you can't cheat. The only rule is that you can't cheat. Okay, and now I'm going to get my laser pointed. Mine's going to be stationary, so I'm not actually trying to run away from your dot. But let me get so you're not looking, right? Okay, don't hunt yet, because I haven't planted my dot yet. Okay. Whoops. Okay, do a little search. I don't even see your dot. Are you pushing? Oh yeah, okay. Warmer. Now see, we're not actually supposed to cheat here. He's supposed to just randomly, you have no way of knowing where this is. And okay, you can look now. The dot, my dot is over there. See it? Do you see my dot? Now if you look, do you see my dot over there? You can actually do it if you look. Boom, we did it. Okay, but the difference was sight, right? If you can look, you can do it. Thank you. You get to keep the laser. No, you don't. What's easy to do with insight or sight is very hard to do if you're just stumbling around blind. And according to the Darwinian story, everything happened to make human beings by blind stumbling. That just cannot work. So, this ceiling is pretty big. That challenge was pretty hard. It would take, eventually, if you were up here for 4 hours, you'd get it. We could make it a lot harder, and that's not so far nearly as hard as finding a functional protein by chance. So the search, what I'm trying to visualize here is how hard is the search that a Darwinian process would need to successfully complete to stumble on an amino acid sequence that would make one of these folded proteins. And it's harder than laser dot on this ceiling. It's harder, in fact, than a very small laser dot on the largest ceiling in the world, which is the Boeing plant up in Everett. This is the largest ceiling in the world. If we cleared all the aircraft out of there and had you volunteering with your laser pointer blindfolded, you'd spend a good chunk of your life probably before you could get so close and you just wouldn't make it. But it's harder than that, okay, as hard as that is. For the protein challenge, for a blind search to find a protein sequence turns out to be as hard as finding a dot the size of a hydrogen atom, which is much smaller than a laser dot, on a ceiling the size of the backdrop of the visible universe. Okay, so if you had a sphere enclosing the visible universe, and you had a hydrogen atom, and someone searching around with a hydrogen atom-sized laser dot, it just would not happen, right? That just would not happen. 1 in 10 to the 77th power is what the published number is. 1 in a trillion, 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 trillion. That's how astonishingly improbable it is for one protein molecule. You have tens of thousands of them. Every cell uses thousands of them. It can't happen. Now, of course, I know if you tell a biologically trained person, they'll say, well, what about all these things that Axe didn't tell you about? What I want to say is there's a simple way to say that none of that matters, okay? And I'm not trying to be dismissive. It really does not change the argument, because the argument is basically this, that a process that's capable of taking nonsense, chaos, and organizing it into something sensible has to involve insight. It has to involve knowledge, because accident is the alternative. For this to happen by accident is to say that accident as a cause can do what genius as a cause can do. But accident is the absence of genius, right? So these are polar opposite causes. For accident to do what insight and genius normally would do would require a fantastically improbable coincidence. It would require a spooky coincidence. That's why the 4-year-old knows that his brother or his sister spelled out pasta on the soup, right? Accident cannot do what genius can do. To claim otherwise is to claim a spooky coincidence, and nobody believes in spooky coincidences for a good reason, right? So for the same reason that we know that accident is not an adequate cause for this, and we can rule it out with certainty, it does not matter if someone says, well, if someone gives you a complex version of accident and says, well, but there's physics involved and there's surface tension in the letters of the alphabet, pasta, and there's thermal agitation, you could say, you can go on and on and on. If at the end of the day you're saying accidental causes cause something sensible to come about by accident, you're simply appealing to a spooky coincidence. You're just giving it different names. If you say surface tension, you just said, okay, that's the kind of spooky coincidence you're appealing to. Or if you said maybe the initial conditions of the universe were just right for this pot of alphabet soup to spell stop playing with your food. Okay, you've just renamed your spooky coincidence. It was the initial you're appealing only to a spooky coincidence, and you can change the name of it, but as long as you're saying that happened by accident, I don't believe you, right? And no one should believe you, because accident shouldn't be able to do this, because the causes are so different. You can put any complex PhD level language you want on it. If you're talking about an accident, it shouldn't do this. It's a spooky coincidence. That's the non-PhD language, okay? And so all of 150 years of evolutionary biology is trying to put complex names on this claim that an accident did what we know only can happen by intelligence. And it's really just a complex way to disguise what is a spooky coincidence. You can't get out of it. So all of these layers, all of these thousands and tens of thousands of papers, you don't need to read them, Because if at the end of the day people are claiming that accidents did what brilliance is required for, they're claiming a spooky coincidence. End of argument, okay? They can make it hard for you to go read the papers, but your answer is, I don't need to read the papers. If you're saying it was an accident, I don't care what kind of accident, I don't care what kind of words you want to put around the accident, you're claiming a spooky coincidence. If that's true of this, a sentence, it is far more true of this. The claim that a lifeless planet came to be teeming with these brilliant creatures, these remarkable cacti that just tower above you, and roadrunners, things that I've never seen. So I'm still blown away by seeing new things that I've never seen before. If it's true of a sentence written in alphabet soup, it's far more abundantly true of this. A claim that accidents did this is a claim of spooky coincidence. It doesn't matter how technical you make that claim. So that's the argument from observation, coupled it with an argument from introspection. And it really gives you, I think, two commonsensical ways to know that we cannot be accidents. We're here because someone put us here. And we knew that, and the 4-year-olds know that. Thank you very much.